Janet, I know some people have got presentations and Janet has not. Janet's going to just talk to us and tell us about it. So you have 8 minutes starting from now, so welcome.
You notice I've got no slides and I've got no watch, but I will keep my 8 minutes within the sort of set.
You're talking about, you're going to be talking specifically about growing resistance to net insecticides.
I am indeed.
Great.
So growing resistance to net insecticides. I guess the first point, which everybody in the room I suspect already knows, is that there is only one insecticide class at the moment that sits on nets, which is the pyrethroid insecticides. And the issue that we're looking at there is whether or not resistance to those pyrethroid insecticides is ultimately going to negatively impact on the efficiency of those nets. So about 10, 15 years ago, I think most people would have said we didn't have an issue with pyrethroid resistance. I mean, in fact, I think there are several papers in the press that suggested exactly that. I think it wasn't true even then. I think we didn't, at that point, have many people looking at resistance, particularly in Africa. And we only had the basic technologies of looking at bioassays to actually detect the resistance. With the genesis of PCR to be able to detect one of the very common mechanisms of pyrethroid resistance, and that's one that was linked to DDT because they have a common target site, it became very easy for almost anybody to actually check whether you had pyrethroid resistance in your populations of mosquitoes. And suddenly on the map of Africa, we got hotspots of pyrethroid resistance showing up. Many a time I've sat in meetings and said, actually, that wasn't, even then, a map of the distribution of resistance. That was a map of the distribution of entomologists looking at resistance. So what they were seeing was where they were looking. And there were whole swathes of Africa with no resistance reported because nobody was actually looking within the sort of set. What is clear, though, is that with the scale-up of nets, the increased use of pyrethroids in agriculture, and with the increased use of pyrethroids for indoor residual spraying, all of which have happened as the malaria scale-up has happened over this last decade, is that resistance has clearly increased. Now, we've been very lucky because the pyrethroid resistance that we started with was that old DDT pyrethroid resistance. We know, looking back historically, that a lot of that was originally selected by DDT use, and that produces very low levels of pyrethroid resistance, unlike in houseflies, for example, where the same mechanism produces much higher levels of resistance. There's a warning signal there, though, because with houseflies, there is a second mutation that goes with that first KDR mutation, and that in houseflies many years ago actually killed pyrethroids for housefly control. Now, for the moment, we don't have what they call the super KDR mutation in mosquitoes. I don't know why we don't. It could be quite possible that that could come along, but at the moment it hasn't been selected. On the back of the KDR sort of set, which has been large scale around Africa, there is then a second type of resistance that has started to come up. That's metabolic resistance. It is selected by the pyrethroids, and it generally produces much higher levels of resistance. We know that's happened in southern Africa on the Mozambique border, and we know that's spreading. And it's spreading in the second mosquito vector in Africa, Anopheles funestus, primarily, rather than Anopheles gambi to start with. That looks like it could well impact on the efficiency of both nets and indoor residual spraying with pyrethroids. And it is hugely important that we actually have the next generation of nets that aren't completely reliant on pyrethroids coming through, that we have proper testing going on in the field to make sure that we know what resistance is out there, and that we actually then make sure that we distribute nets that work rather than nets that are starting to fail. What evidence have we got so far that it's failing? Well, in fact, we've recently done a systematic review. I was hoping by the time this meeting came out it would be published, but it's still under review, but at least it's out for review. That systematic review looks at the papers that have been published over the last decade, and there are over 1,000 of them that tackle this subject. Sadly, I think there are only about 26 that have actually looked at the question in a way that the data has any real meaning within the sort of set. And of those 26, none of them allow us to answer the question, does pyrethroid resistance currently impact on malaria transmission? because it hasn't, the work just hasn't been done in that format. The question that we can answer from the information that is out there is that pyrethroid resistance at the moment impacts on the entomological indicators of the effectiveness of bed nets. So mosquitoes live longer than they did earlier after exposure to the pyrethroid nets. They're still able to reproduce, and they're still able to bite, take a blood meal. So I think we've got early indications that problems are coming, but still quite a lot of work to do before we are absolutely sure exactly how much the pyrethroid resistance that's out there at the moment is impacting. If you want my best guess at the moment, and it's an educated guess, but I don't, as I've already said, have the information, as other people don't either, that the first wave of pyrethroid resistance that we've got, which is at the moment the most predominant, i.e. the old DDT KDR resistance, is not impacting. If you get layered on top of that a metabolic resistance that produces resistance to pyrethroids of 100-fold plus in some instances, that is when we are going to see the impact on nets. And that type of resistance is already starting to spread in many parts of Africa, and it will get worse, not better, as things move along. So we really do need to make sure that the nets that are coming through and the next generation that are coming through are pyrethroid plus nets, if you like. That's pyrethroids plus either another insecticide or a synergist or a growth regulator, start to get traction in those areas where pyrethroid resistance is starting to become an issue, and that work is really pushed forward very quickly to make sure that the third generation of nets that don't rely on pyrethroids at all come through to the market in a timely fashion. I can't believe I'm very far off 8 minutes at that, so I think that's where I will stop.
Brilliant. That's 6 minutes. There you go. You've shown the other people on the panel how to do it. Really interesting. So, okay, so you're saying, I mean, a couple of things. 26 out of the 1,000 studies have not even come into this area. What's
only 26 of the 1,000.
Yes, only 26. So a couple of things from that. Why is that? So it's because we've got a whole chain, haven't we? We've got the research through to the manufacturing, through to the distribution, through to the sort of NGOs. We've got this whole chain that gets the research and then the bed nets at the end to the people who need it. Mm-hmm. Well, what's going wrong at the research end? So
I think at the research end, a number of those studies, to be fair, were not set up to specifically answer that question. But if you do a search, a systematic review, you would search on the keywords and then say, can you include them in the meta-analysis within the sort of set? And then it's looking at how that analysis was done and have they fulfilled the criteria that you can actually use to include those within the study. Yeah. So the whole systematic review will be published and it will give you the inclusion criteria. It will also give all the papers that haven't been included within that set and the reasons why they haven't been included there. And the systematic review then tries to just work with the data rather than doing, as I've just done here, the best guess and take it through. So to try and let the data speak for itself. But if you look at most of the studies, most of them don't fulfill the criteria for inclusion into the sort of set for a whole raft of reasons, and I don't have time to go into all the reasons here.
But when you look at the system, you're saying we need second and third generation nets. Where do you see we are on that journey of creating them, understanding the needs, actually having the manufacturing, having the distribution in place for that to happen?
So we've understood, I think, for quite a while that we need the second generation nets, and those are coming through. We already have some that have come to the market. We have others that are coming to the market. At the moment, we don't have a good means of evaluating how well they work against resistant populations or not. So there isn't a system there to properly do that. But the second generation systems are already well on their way. It's the third generation that's a problem because we don't have a whole raft of insecticides that are suitable for putting on nets. If we did, we could do it tomorrow. So that's the problem, that we've got to get those new insecticides coming through the system to be able to put something on nets that works to protect the individual that's sleeping under the net as well as the population. So the reason pyrethroids are so good is that they act very quickly. They've got very low mammalian toxicity, and they've also got a fairly strong repellent element on there. And that means somebody sleeping under that net doesn't get bitten. If you put a lot of other insecticides on the net, if those insecticides take days to kill, the mosquitoes still come in, they still bite the person under the net. They may get killed subsequently, so you get a population effect, but you don't actually protect the person sleeping under the net. And that may make it far more difficult to get people to actually use nets if they don't feel that they're getting any direct benefit from it.
Okay, so we're going to move on, but I think as we go along, we'll pick up issues, because I mean, there are two issues, well, three issues. One is about the research, one is about the evaluation of even the second generation nets, and one is about the creation of third generation nets and who's doing the work. And I know the great thing is we've got manufacturers in the room, so we can bring that into the debate. So I'm not going to answer all these questions now, but I think as we go along, we should be picking these up.